Just a floor nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer saw at 8:15 a.m. when he stepped onto the third-floor trauma unit at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah, watching Margaret Walsh empty a bedpan with her gloved hands moving through the task like it was muscle memory carved 17 years deep. He didn't see the surgical precision in how she positioned herself, weight on her left leg, right hip angle to minimize strain on her lower back, exactly as you'd stand during a 6-hour emergency thoracotomy. He didn't see the scars on her forearms, thin white lines mapped like a topographic chart of Helmand Province, barely visible beneath her scrubs but there if you knew what you were looking for. He just saw a woman in a blue uniform at 5:06 a.m., arriving early again, staying late again, the kind of employee hospitals exploit because they show up before the sun does and leave after it sets. Margaret had been at St. Michael's for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Nobody counted except her. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional frequency above rows of identical hospital beds, that hum that eventually colonizes your nervous system until silence feels like deafness. The linoleum floors smelled of antiseptic and institutional bleach so sharp it burned the back of your throat, a smell that never quite left your scrubs no matter how many times you washed them. Margaret moved through room 314 with the kind of quiet efficiency that made other nurses look lazy by comparison. Corporal Danny Reeves occupied that room, 24 years old, Army Ranger, paralyzed from the waist down after an IED detonation outside Fallujah had rewired his nervous system into something he no longer recognized as his own body. He lay in the bed with his eyes tracking the ceiling, and on his chest, pressed against his hospital gown, was a folded flag. Not the flag they'd given him at the ceremony. This was the flag from his team leader's coffin, folded by hands that had shaken, crease lines sharp enough to cut glass, colors of blue and red and white that meant everything he'd failed to protect. Margaret checked his catheter bag without being asked, her movements economical and precise, nothing wasted. She adjusted his pillow slightly, supporting his head in the exact position that prevented pressure ulcers while maintaining airway patency, and Reeves watched her hands work with an intensity that felt almost predatory. His eyes didn't leave her face. "You good, Corporal?" Her voice dropped at the end of sentences, like a question mark that wasn't quite sure about its own punctuation. "Yeah." He paused. "You move like you've done this before." Margaret didn't answer. She was already checking his full line, her fingers confirming the needle gauge and drip rate with a touch that felt diagnostic, like she could read his blood pressure just by feeling the pulse in his wrist. She saw the tremor in his hand, not fear she recognized immediately, but the specific fine motor shake that came from phantom pain signals firing through a spinal cord that no longer connected to anything useful. She found the morphine drip. The dose was inadequate. Whoever had set it during the night shift had calculated for average pain management, not for the specific neurological screaming that came with spinal cord injury, where pain signals fire in patterns that standard dosing protocols weren't designed to manage. Margaret didn't consult the chart. She knew how to read it already. She'd reviewed it at 5:52 a.m. when she arrived, the way she reviewed every chart on the unit, the way she'd been reviewing charts for 3 years without anyone noticing because reviewing charts was not in the job description for a floor nurse, but it prevented complications. She adjusted the drip rate with the confidence of someone who'd done field trauma medicine in combat conditions where waiting for a physician's order meant watching a patient die. 30 seconds. Morphine uptake would stabilize within 4 minutes. Reeves' breathing would deepen slightly. The phantom pain would recede from a 8 out of 10 to a manageable 4. "Better?" she asked. "Yeah." His voice cracked. "Yeah, how did you?" "You're welcome." Margaret was already moving to the next room, her shift not waiting for gratitude, her hands already thinking about what needed doing before her conscious mind caught up. This was the problem with 3 years at St. Michael's. She'd learned everyone's rhythms, everyone's insufficient protocols, everyone's blind spots. And she kept her mouth shut and fixed things quietly because talking would raise questions she couldn't answer. She arrived the next morning at 5:43 a.m. The morning after that at 5:51 a.m. The morning after that at 5:46 a.m., never exactly the same time so nobody could say she was consistent, but always at least 43 minutes early, always before the sun broke over the Georgia marshland beyond the hospital's eastern windows. By 6:15 a.m., before most of the day's shift even thought about showering, Margaret had reviewed the charts on all 14 beds in her unit, identified 3 medication discrepancies that another nurse would have missed, and prevented one patient from receiving a dosage that would have caused a drug interaction with his beta blockers. She charted this in meticulous detail. Every chart note was timestamped with precision, every observation numbered and cross-referenced, every decision documented in language so clear and specific that a physician reading it 3 years later would understand exactly what had been happening on the unit at 6:07 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. St. Michael's charting system was designed by people who'd never actually worked in a hospital. Margaret's charting made it better. She stayed late because patients didn't stop needing care at 3 p.m. just because the shift ended. She stayed because Corporal Reeves had started requesting her specifically, his voice quiet when she arrived for the night shift, asking if Margaret was on, and she'd realized 2 weeks ago that he recognized something in her, not what she was, but the fact that she was not what she appeared to be. She stayed because the paralyzed ranger with his folded flag was trying to heal from the same war that had ended Captain Margaret Walsh, and if she could make his pain slightly more manageable at midnight when the night shift was short-staffed and overextended, then she would. By week 3 of this pattern, she documented more clinically relevant observations than most nurses recorded in 6 months. By month 2, her charting had begun to catch small things, equipment discrepancies, medication ordering patterns that didn't match patient census, supply requisitions that seemed inflated compared to actual usage. She noticed because she noticed everything. She'd been trained to notice everything. In Helmand Province, noticing small inconsistencies had kept 17 people alive. At St. Michael's, noticing small inconsistencies was just part of the job. Dr. Mercer watched her from the hallway at 8:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October when the weather had turned, when the humidity finally broke and Savannah's air became almost breathable again. She was updating Corporal Reeves' chart, her hand moving across the screen with the kind of specificity that made other nurses' documentation look like they'd written it while blindfolded. Reeves watched her the way a person who'd been through trauma watches someone who understands trauma without having to ask about it. "Morning, Margaret." Dr. Mercer's voice had the tone of a man greeting someone he'd already decided was beneath his notice. "Good morning, Dr. Mercer." She didn't look up from the chart. Respectful. Deferential. The kind of voice that made it clear she understood the hierarchy, understood that the man in the expensive shoes got deference whether or not it was earned. This was the Margaret Walsh that St. Michael's knew. Not the one who'd led trauma teams through sandstorms. Not the one who'd performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife because surgical instruments weren't available. Just a nurse. Just the woman who arrived early and stayed late and made everyone else look bad by comparison. Dr. Mercer continued down the hallway. He didn't notice the way her hands moved, steady as a surgical laser, confirming details in patient charts that would matter later. He didn't notice that she was building a record, documenting everything, creating a paper trail so meticulous and precise that it would become impossible for anyone to dispute what she'd seen and when she'd seen it. He didn't notice because he wasn't looking for that kind of threat. But that wasn't the worst part. The red marker was still wet when Margaret saw it. Tuesday morning, 7:15, the unit board outside the break room displaying her name like a public execution notice. Nurse M. Walsh, improper charting, failure to follow protocol. Dr. Mercer had written it large enough that visitors couldn't miss it walking past, and the ink bled slightly at the edges like he'd pressed hard, wanting the words to bleed into the wall itself. She read it once. She didn't read it again. That was the mistake, not reading it, but standing there long enough for 3 nurses to notice her noticing, and the way their eyes scattered away told her everything about what Mercer had already said in private, late-night calls, careful whispers about liability concerns and aggressive independence and how Margaret always thought she knew better than the doctors. The morning rounds moved like clockwork, 7:08 a.m., Dr. Mercer walking through with his tablet and his pressed white coat, the kind of pristine that comes from never actually touching patients, only observing them from a distance that preserved his authority and his hands. Margaret followed 2 steps behind, as protocol required, as she had done for 3 years without incident, without a single notation in her file until 8 days ago when Mercer decided that meticulousness was the same as disobedience. The unit smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of a building where sick people slept. She had learned years ago not to smell it anymore, to let it become air. Room 314. Corporal Danny Reeves lay in the standard position, his paralyzed frame arranged the way Margaret had arranged it, his chart at the foot of the bed showing vitals that she had checked 4 times during night shift because something in his breathing pattern had shifted by half a degree, barely measurable except to someone trained to see what other people missed. His parents sat in chairs that hadn't been comfortable 10 minutes after they'd sat down, his mother holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his father reading a newspaper from yesterday because holding something gave the hands a purpose. They had driven 11 hours from North Carolina on Sunday. They looked the way all families looked when their son came home from the war with his legs attached to his body but his mind understanding that those legs would never move again. Margaret had adjusted Corporal Reeves' morphine drip at 6:30 that morning. The 4 catheter was positioned at an angle that created resistance in the line, reducing flow rate by approximately 7%, nothing catastrophic, nothing that would cause harm, but measurable, and Margaret measured things. She had repositioned the tape, angled the tubing, set the drip rate with the precision of someone who had done this in field surgical units where guesswork was the same as allowing a patient to suffer unnecessarily. Mercer hadn't been there. Mercer wasn't there when she did it. But he was there now. "Nurse Walsh," he said, and the words came out like an announcement. "Perhaps you could explain why you're adjusting medications without physician authorization." The room went still. Mercer's presence did that, made the air pressure change, made everyone in a 5-foot radius understand that something dangerous had shifted. Margaret was holding the chart. She lowered it slowly, the paper rustling like wind through dead leaves. The 4 angle was restricting flow, Margaret said. Her voice came out level, the voice she used in situations where showing emotion was the same as losing. Patient was receiving 73% of prescribed dose. I corrected the mechanical issue. This is exactly the cowboy mentality I've been documenting, Mercer said, and he was looking past Margaret toward Reeves' parents, wanting them to see his authority, wanting to establish his version of the story before theirs could form. "You're a floor nurse, not a physician. Or have you forgotten your place, Bedpan Betty?" The nickname landed in the silence like a rock through glass. He said it casually, the way someone might comment on the weather, but Margaret felt Corporal Reeves' eyes move toward her with a sudden intensity that suggested he recognized something in the way Mercer had deployed the word, as a weapon, as an instrument of degradation, as a tool for establishing hierarchy. Reeves' mother looked away. His father folded the newspaper very slowly, very deliberately, as though the paper required his complete attention. Margaret held Mercer's stare for 3 seconds. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She didn't feel the flush of anger that other people experienced in moments like this, instead she felt a kind of absolute cold clarity, the same sensation that came during combat operations when your nervous system understood that you were in the presence of a predator and every system you possessed had to remain still, had to remain lethal, had to remain under perfect control. In those 3 seconds, she saw everything about Dr. Mercer, the way he needed the audience, the way he required his authority to be witnessed and acknowledged, the way his hand shook very slightly when he was making a public demonstration because he was fundamentally uncertain of his own competence and this was his mechanism for maintaining the illusion. "You practice medicine the way a vulture practices flight," Margaret said. Her voice was quieter than it had been before. "You only show up when something's already dying." Then she turned and walked away. Her footsteps on the tile floor sounded like a metronome, deliberate, measured, controlled. She could feel Mercer's eyes on her spine, feel the shock radiating from him because nobody spoke to him that way, because his position had trained him to expect deference and instead he had received an observation so accurate that it had landed like a blade. Behind her, she heard Reeves' mother exhale as though she had been holding her breath. She did not look back. The break room at 2:30 was arranged the way it always was, 3 round tables with uncomfortable chairs, a refrigerator humming in the corner, a microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn from approximately 1987. Margaret carried her coffee, black, no sugar, the kind of coffee that tasted like discipline, and she sat at the table nearest the window where the afternoon light made everything visible and the shadows under her eyes less pronounced. For 37 seconds, the room was normal. Nurses sat, scrolled their phones, discussed patients in low voices. Then Emily Chen and Patricia Morrison stood simultaneously, their chairs scraping against the floor with synchronized rejection. Then Jessica Okoye. Then Sarah Webb, who had been friendly exactly 4 days before Mercer had a private conversation with someone about liability concerns. No one spoke. They simply left, their absence creating a gap in the room that felt deliberate, orchestrated, meaningful in its coordination. Margaret could hear them in the hallway, whispers, careful words, voices that carried only as far as they needed to. Mercer says she's aggressive. He said to watch for safety violations. I heard she questioned him in front of a patient's family. The whispers weren't random. They were planted seeds, watered daily, tended by someone with the authority to make people believe that loyalty to him was safety and loyalty to Margaret was risk. Margaret drank her coffee. It was still hot enough to taste bitter. She didn't look out the window. She didn't cry or leave or show anything other than a woman sitting alone at a table, existing quietly in a space that had chosen not to contain her anymore. What Margaret didn't know was that those whispers were part of a larger architecture that Dr. Mercer had been constructing for months, a framework of documentation, of carefully coached witnesses, of incident reports that created a narrative of her as someone dangerous, someone whose independence from protocol represented institutional liability. He had been building this long before Tuesday morning, long before the red marker on the unit board, because he had seen something in her charts that terrified him more than any competence ever could have. He had seen the pattern. Margaret logged everything with the precision of someone trained in trauma medicine where documentation wasn't bureaucracy, it was survival. She recorded supply usage down to individual gauze pads, for placements, medication dosages, information that should have been invisible, should have been buried in the volume of normal hospital operations. But Mercer had been inflating surgical supply orders for 8 months, routing payments through his brother-in-law's shell company, splitting kickbacks with Apex Medical Supply that added up to approximately $74,000, and Margaret's meticulous charting had already created a pattern that a forensic accountant would recognize instantly. Every order that didn't match her documented usage created a discrepancy. Every discrepancy was a thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. He needed her gone before anyone pulled that thread. He needed her to become so publicly unreliable that her evidence would be inadmissible, so thoroughly discredited that her charts would be questioned, so completely removed from the institution that she couldn't testify if anyone ever asked her to explain what she had observed. The red marker on the unit board was just the beginning. The public humiliation was stage 2. The orchestrated rejection was stage 3. And none of it would matter because Mercer didn't understand what he was actually standing next to. Thursday night, 11:02 p.m., room 309. The patient's oxygen saturation had been climbing steadily since Margaret changed the 4-drip 4 hours earlier, steady at 96, comfortable, stable. Now it was 68. Then 62. The monitor's alarm screamed like a warning siren nobody wanted to hear. Massive pulmonary embolism. A blood clot the size of a coin had traveled from the patient's leg, lodged itself in the pulmonary artery, and was strangling her lungs. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, stood in the doorway with her mouth half open. Her hands hung at her sides. She wasn't moving. The code team was 3 floors down. The crash cart was in the ICU. The patient was dying right now, in this room, with nobody doing anything. Margaret looked at the patient's face, a woman named Patricia Holloway, 67, admitted 3 days ago for post-op recovery, breathing like she was sucking air through a straw. Then she looked at the clock. Then at her own hands. 15 years dissolved into the moment. Not 15 years of nursing, 15 years of trauma medicine in the deserts of Helmand province, holding a field surgical unit under siege for 11 hours while mortars fell like rain, her hand steady as a surgical laser even as the walls shook around her. She moved. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Her voice dropped an octave. Now. A nursing student, couldn't have been more than 23, with trembling fingers and eyes wide as coin slots, grabbed the needle from the crash cart that Margaret had never left the unit without access to. The girl pressed it into Margaret's palm like it was a holy relic. Margaret's other hand was already finding landmarks on Patricia's chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers reading the ribs like braille. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. Fast. Surgical. Certain. The hiss of air escaping was the loudest sound in the room. Patricia gasped. Her lungs screamed back into function. Oxygen saturation began its climb, 62, 68, 75, climbing like a runner finding her stride. Margaret kept her hand steady, monitoring the needle, watching for the pink foam that would tell her the decompression was working. Dr. Chen stood frozen in the doorway, her clipboard forgotten, her mouth still half open like she was trying to form a word that didn't exist in English. O2 continuing to climb, Margaret said quietly, her eyes never leaving the monitor. 88, 91. Stable. She looked at Patricia's face, the panic draining out like water, color returning to gray cheeks, breathing becoming something that didn't sound like survival anymore. Just breathing. Normal. Human. Alive. 30 seconds. That's all it took to end a career, though none of them knew it yet. Dr. Chen stepped forward slowly, like someone waking from a very long sleep. Where did you learn to do that? Her voice was smaller than it had been that morning, when she'd been rounding and hadn't even looked at Margaret as she passed. Margaret didn't answer. She was already checking Patricia's pupils. Already looking for secondary complications. Already 3 steps ahead in her head, the way combat medicine had trained her to be. The way you survive Helmand Province, you don't think about the moment you're in. You think about the moment coming next, and the one after that, and the one after that. Stay ahead of the chaos or the chaos eats you. I'm going to need you to document everything you just did. Dr. Chen's voice had steadied. This was a doctor now, not a frozen observer. This was someone recognizing expertise when it was standing right in front of her in scrubs and a name badge. That was. She paused. That wasn't in our protocol, but that was correct. That was absolutely correct. Margaret stripped the gloves from her hands with a snap that echoed across the room. I'm going on break, she said quietly. She moved past Dr. Chen toward the door, her voice steady as stone. Patient stable. Monitor her O2 and vitals every 15 minutes. Watch for secondary complications. The break room was empty at midnight. The coffee was cold. Margaret stood at the window and watched the rain hammer the parking lot below, sheets of water catching the sodium lights like applause for something nobody was celebrating. She'd performed a needle decompression with nothing but a 14-gauge catheter and her hands. She'd done it without asking permission. She'd done it without waiting for the attending physician to tell her it was acceptable. She'd done it the way she'd done 1,000 things in Helmand Province, because waiting for authorization when someone was dying was just another word for murder. By 6:02 a.m., Dr. Mercer had already moved. The termination paperwork was printed and waiting in personnel with a timestamp of 5:51 a.m. Unauthorized invasive procedures. Reckless endangerment of patient safety. Exceeding scope of practice. Violation of hospital protocol subsection 4.7.2, which required physician approval for any invasive intervention whatsoever. He'd attached witness statements from 2 nurses, neither of whom had actually been in room 309, but both of whom confirmed a concerning pattern of overreach based on what they'd heard. He'd photocopied 3 of her previous write-ups. He'd built the case like an architect building a wall, brick by brick, documentation by documentation, making sure that every single element was in place and properly mortared. Margaret didn't know he'd also done something else. At 4:33 a.m., while she was still on shift, while she was monitoring Patricia Holloway's vitals and watching the patient sleep the sleep of someone who'd been given a second life, Mercer had called a contact at Apex Medical Supply. I need you to look at the equipment orders for trauma supplies, he'd said quietly, his voice the texture of a knife edge. The ones from the past 18 months. Tell me what you see. The voice on the other end had gone quiet. Then, some of these don't match our invoices. Some of these are double-billed. Where did these numbers come from? Mercer's jaw had tightened. He knew exactly where they came from. He knew because he'd written them. Margaret's meticulous charting had done more than document patient care. Every single equipment order that had passed through her hands, every surgical kit, every medication, every trauma supply had been recorded with date, time, quantity, and serial number. Not because the hospital required that level of detail. Because she was a combat medic, and combat medics kept records that would survive an investigation, because in Helmand Province, when something went wrong, the paperwork was the only thing that stood between you and a firing squad. She'd flagged 3 orders that didn't match requisitions. 5 that had been billed twice. A surgical kit marked depleted and discarded that had never actually been used on a patient. She'd been too meticulous for her own good. The pattern was there in her notes like a map, if anyone cared to read it. Mercer had taken approximately $487,000 from the hospital over 18 months by inflating equipment orders and splitting the difference with Apex Medical Supplies manager, a man named Brett Holloway, whose cousin Patricia happened to be recovering in room 309. The invoices were doctored. The delivery receipts didn't match the actual supplies. The payments had gone into a shell account under Mercer's brother-in-law's name, then been moved offshore. But none of that mattered right now, because what Mercer didn't know was already happening. At 5:52 a.m., the hospital's grants coordinator had submitted St. Michael's Federal Trauma Center application, which required background checks on all clinical staff with direct patient care responsibilities. That application had flagged every nurse, every doctor, every tech. Margaret Walsh's social security number had been entered into a federal database at 6:03 a.m. At 6:14 a.m., that number had pinged a classified database at the Pentagon that hadn't been accessed in 8 years. The database contained one name, one rank, one service record. Captain Margaret Walsh. Codename Valkyrie. The paperwork moved slowly in the federal system. These things took time, but it moved. Someone in a suit at the Pentagon would see that flag. Someone would make a phone call. Someone would remember that Captain Margaret Walsh was supposed to be dead, or disappeared, or officially non-existent. And someone would start asking very loud questions about why a nurse in Savannah, Georgia had just performed a combat emergency decompression on a civilian patient at exactly the moment her classified clearance was being reviewed. But that wasn't the worst part. What nobody knew yet was that Corporal Danny Reeves, the paralyzed Army Ranger in room 401, the one who'd replaced Margaret in her exact role with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines before the war had taken everything from him, had been watching her from his hospital bed. He'd been watching her move through the hallways for 3 weeks with a recognition that nobody else could see. He'd heard about the emergency decompression through the hospital grapevine, the way rumors moved through recovery wards like electricity through wet wire. And he'd wheeled himself to the nurse's station at 2:36 a.m. on Friday morning to ask a single question that changed everything. That nurse, he'd said quietly to the night charge nurse. The older one. The tall one. Does she have a scar on her left forearm? Shaped like a question mark. The charge nurse had looked at him like he'd asked her to solve theoretical physics. I don't know. Why? Because I know her, Danny had said. From before. And if she's here, and she just did what I heard she did, then the Pentagon needs to know about it. Today. Not next week. Today. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot at 6:36 a.m., watching the rain continue its assault on the windshield, her hands finally steady but her chest tight with something that felt like knowing. She'd broken protocol. She'd saved a life. She'd done it the way she'd been trained to do it in a war that had supposedly never happened, by an army that had supposedly never sent her, in a role that had supposedly never existed. She'd left the fingerprints of Captain Margaret Walsh all over room 309, and she hadn't even known she was doing it. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something terrible. Friday morning at 9:15, Margaret sat in Administrator Patricia Vance's office and watched Dr. Mercer place a folder on the desk between them. 4 inches thick. The color of old institutional paper and ruined lives. Outside, rain hammered the windows with the sound of 1,000 fingers demanding entry. We've completed our review, Vance said, her voice the texture of someone apologizing for something she'd already decided. Mercer didn't speak. He didn't need to. He sat with the posture of a man who'd already won, whose satisfaction was so complete it had calcified into something like peace. Vance opened the folder. Incident reports. Witness statements. Documentation so meticulously fabricated it made Margaret's chest tighten. She recognized the signature style, the careful selection of details that sounded true because they were arranged like a sentence she'd never spoken. Protocol subsection 4.7.2. Unauthorized procedures. Pattern of insubordination. Failure to respect physician authority. A reckless endangerment charge that hung in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. Effective immediately, Vance said, your employment is terminated. You'll surrender your badge, your access credentials, and any hospital property in your possession. Your final check will be mailed within 10 business days, less the cost of your uniform replacement. Margaret didn't move. The silence in the room became a third presence, something with weight and temperature. The incident in room 309 was the final documentation we needed, Mercer said, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. That patient could have died from complications. You endangered lives by stepping outside your scope of practice. She'd saved that patient's life. A needle decompression, done with precision born from 15 years of trauma medicine in places where mistakes meant body bags and chaplains. But she couldn't say that. She couldn't explain why her hands moved like they'd been trained by the Army Medical Corps to function under fire. She couldn't tell them that the patient in room 309 would have coded and flatlined without her intervention, that his widow would be planning a funeral right now instead of visiting him in recovery. She couldn't defend herself. Not without breaking cover. Captain Margaret Walsh didn't exist anymore. Not on paper. Not in any official capacity. The black operation in Helmand Province had gone wrong, catastrophically wrong, and everything connected to it had been buried in classified archives with a classified stamp and orders delivered by a 2-star general: scrub the records, seal the decorations, erase the service. Never surface. Never claim what you earned. Never break the silence, or you'll compromise operations that are still in the field. Those weren't suggestions. They were commands. To defend herself now would be to violate direct orders. To expose classified operations. To confirm the existence of a woman who'd been officially erased from every system except one, the Pentagon's classified personnel database, where her social security number sat like a landmine waiting for the right trigger. She couldn't explain why her hands knew exactly where to position a needle between ribs. She couldn't tell Vance why Corporal Reeve sometimes looked at her with eyes that recognized something nobody else could see. She couldn't say, I've held more people together than you've had administrative meetings, Dr. Mercer. I've operated in tents where the walls were canvas and the ceiling was rocket fire, and the only difference between success and mass casualties was whether my hand stayed steady. She reached up and unclipped her badge. The laminated rectangle felt heavier than it should have, the way objects feel when you're handing over something that meant something. She set it on the desk between the folder and her own hands, which didn't tremble. Her hands had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury reserved for people who weren't holding lives. They stayed still, as if she were about to perform surgery. As if this moment required the same precision as everything else she'd done in this hospital. I understand, she said. She stood. She walked out of that office without looking at Mercer, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing anything crack. The door closed behind her with the soft precision of something closing on a coffin. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, she was sitting at her kitchen table, and she was crying. Not in the way people usually cry. Not the gasping, shoulder-shaking kind that releases pressure. This was something colder. Quieter. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep inside you that it doesn't even know how to make noise. Her daughter Emma found her like that, still in her scrubs, the hospital badge sitting on the counter like a severed finger, her eyes fixed on something nobody else could see. Emma was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's easy smile, and she'd inherited the kind of emotional intelligence that made her dangerous in the way that only children can be. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just climbed into Margaret's lap and pressed her small forehead against her mother's chest. "Mama," she said, "why are you home early?" Margaret couldn't answer. The question was simple, but the answer was a locked door in a classified building in a place that officially didn't exist. The answer was, because I saved a man's life and they fired me for it. Because I can't defend myself without breaking promises made to people with stars on their shoulders. Because the strongest part of me is the part that isn't allowed to exist, and that part just got erased all over again. "Mama." Emma pulled back, studying her mother's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a language she'd never been taught. "What happened?" "Nothing, baby," Margaret said. "Just a hard day at work." It wasn't a lie. It was the worst kind of lie, the kind that was technically true but so hollowed out by omission that it felt like betrayal. Emma stayed quiet, the way children do when they know an adult is breaking in front of them and there's nothing they can do about it but witness it and stay close. Outside, rain continued hammering the windows. Inside, Margaret held her daughter and realized that this was what defeat looked like when you couldn't fight back. This was what it meant to have spent half your life becoming someone you couldn't be anymore. This was what it meant to have hands that knew how to save lives but a voice that had to stay silent. The hospital had taken her badge. Dr. Mercer had made sure of that. But 48 hours later, something else would take notice. Something larger. Something with institutional memory and the authority to reach across state lines and walk through hospital doors like they were air. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she didn't know it yet. 48 hours after Margaret Walsh was terminated for unauthorized procedures, a routine background check landed on Administrator Patricia Vance's desk. St. Michael's had applied for a federal trauma grant, the kind that required security clearance verification for senior medical staff. The form was standard, automated, bureaucratic. The response from the Pentagon Security Division was not. A classified flag appeared in the database. Captain Margaret Walsh. Codename Valkyrie. Service record sealed by executive order. Active clearance status, indefinite. The Pentagon doesn't call hospitals about nurses without cause. By Wednesday morning, men in dress uniforms were walking through the administrative corridor of St. Michael's, their presence making the air pressure change, their boot heels clicking against the tile floor like a countdown. Hospital Administrator Patricia Vance sat rigid in her office chair, watching a Marine colonel in dress blues flip open a leather citation folder. Behind him stood a two-star general with ribbons that stretched across his chest like a color-coded battlefield. They didn't announce themselves with rank. They announced themselves with silence. The kind of silence that comes from men accustomed to absolute authority, the kind that makes civilians unconsciously straighten their posture. "We need to discuss your termination of Captain Margaret Walsh," the general said. 8 words. Not a question. Dr. Mercer was in his office when the call came. Patricia Vance's voice was steady, clipped. "Bring your employment files to conference room B. Now." He arrived thinking documentation would protect him, the write-ups, the witness statements, the protocol violations he'd so carefully constructed. He didn't know what was waiting behind that door. When Dr. Mercer stepped into conference room B, the first thing he saw was Corporal Danny Reeves being wheeled in by a hospital orderly, the young ranger's paralyzed frame secured in his wheelchair, and his eyes meeting Margaret's across the room. A single word escaped his lips like a prayer: Valkyrie. The Marine colonel didn't greet Dr. Mercer. He opened the citation and began to read, his voice carrying the weight of official record, each word precise and irreversible. Silver Star for Valor in combat. Captain Margaret Walsh held a forward surgical unit under siege for 11 hours in Helmand Province, refusing evacuation while enemy fire bracketed the compound. During that engagement, she performed emergency field thoracotomy on 4 soldiers using a combat knife and materials available at the aid station. All 4 survived. Her actions directly resulted in the preservation of 214 lives across multiple operations. The colonel paused, letting the number settle into the silence. Her service record was sealed by executive order. She was classified as deceased in all official records. Her medals were stored in Pentagon archives under restricted access. Dr. Mercer's face drained white. The color didn't fade gradually. It disappeared like blood leaving a wound, leaving his skin the shade of old bone. Before the colonel reached the third line of the citation, before he could continue reading the list of decorations that had been earned but never worn, Dr. Mercer's mouth opened. Stammering came first, then words tumbling like debris. There's been a misunderstanding. Procedural errors. Nothing intentional. I was following hospital protocol. She performed an unauthorized. The two-star general raised one hand. One hand. The movement carried the authority to stop a man mid-sentence the way a traffic officer stops traffic. Dr. Mercer's voice died. You terminated a captain of the United States Army Rangers for performing exactly what we trained her to do, the general said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, present and dangerous and patient. Captain Walsh operated under classified code name Valkyrie in support of operations that saved over 200 lives. She doesn't require authorization from hospital protocol. She requires authorization from the Pentagon. Which she has. Which you didn't have clearance to know she has. The general stepped forward. He looked at Margaret's uniform, the scrubs she'd been wearing, the compression socks, the name badge that said nothing about who she was. He didn't salute. He stood at attention first, bringing himself to formal military position, and then raised his hand in salute to the decoration she had never been allowed to display. It was a salute to an empty chair that was no longer empty. Captain Walsh is cleared for every procedure, every decision, every action she deems medically necessary, the general continued. Your hospital policy does not supersede her clearance level. Your authority does not extend to her decisions. This termination is reversed effective immediately. The investigation into your conduct begins now. Dr. Mercer opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. His hands had begun to shake, a tremor that started in his fingers and spread up through his wrists, the physical manifestation of a career collapsing in real time. In his basement office in the IT department, Marcus Webb was already 3 steps ahead of the Pentagon's arrival. Webb had been a submariner for 12 years, trained to see patterns in data the way sonar operators see shapes in darkness, and he'd been awake since midnight Thursday, pulling security footage, isolating email threads, building a structure of evidence that would stand in any courtroom. Every instance of Mercer deleting surgical supply records from the hospital system appeared on screen. Timestamped, recovered from backup files, beautiful in its clarity. The emails between Mercer and the CEO of Apex Medical Supply were there too, casual at first, then specific, compensation adjustments, quarterly distributions, preferred pricing arrangements. The paper trail Margaret's meticulous charting had inadvertently exposed, Mercer had tried to cover by deleting. But deletion only works if you understand that nothing on a hospital network is ever truly gone. Webb printed everything. 234 pages. He stacked them in a folder and drove downtown to the FBI field office on Drayton Street. He walked directly to the receptionist and said, "I'm here to report healthcare fraud. I have documentation. I need to speak to someone in white-collar crime." The special agent who took the case, a woman named Torres with 15 years of experience in hospital fraud cases, listened to Webb's summary and then said, "How long have you known about this?" "I didn't know," Webb said. "I found out this morning. But the victim, the person he terminated to cover this up, she's a decorated veteran. Army Ranger. And he did it because her charting was getting too good. Too accurate. She was going to expose him whether she meant to or not." Agent Torres nodded. She'd seen this before, the way institutions devour their most honest members and protect their most corrupt. By Friday afternoon, the FBI had secured Mercer's personal and professional financial records. By Monday, they'd frozen his accounts. His attorney called it a misunderstanding. The wire transfer logs called it systemic fraud spanning for years. Apex Medical Supply's CEO, facing charges himself, decided cooperation was more attractive than principal and provided documentation of payments totaling $387,000 in kickbacks. The state medical board moved with the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say slowly but inexorably. For months later, the board voted unanimously to revoke Dr. Mercer's medical license. Not suspended. Revoked. The difference matters. Suspension carries the possibility of reinstatement. Revocation is permanent. No hospital in Georgia would hire him. No hospital in the Southeast would touch him. His name went into a database that every institution consulted before credentialing physicians. Mercer's wife filed for divorce. His house sold at a loss. His country club membership was quietly discontinued. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. 6 months after the Pentagon walked into Conference Room B, Captain Margaret Walsh stood in St. Michael's new trauma wing during the dedication ceremony. The insignia on her uniform was visible now, captain's bars on the collar, the insignia nobody had known to look for because the woman wearing it had been invisible in scrubs. Through the window, she watched the parking lot. A white van with Apex Medical Supply printed on the side pulled in. Dr. Mercer climbed out, work boots on the asphalt, his frame bent under the weight of medical supply boxes stacked almost higher than his head. His expensive suit was gone. His Rolex was gone. The company that had paid him kickbacks had become the only employer willing to hire him, driving deliveries, carrying inventory, making minimum wage plus commission on supplies nobody wanted from him. He didn't see Margaret watching. His eye stayed fixed on the ground in front of him, the way a man looks when he's learned to take up as little space as possible. Inside the trauma wing, Corporal Danny Reeves stood on arm crutches. Partial mobility had returned through experimental treatment Margaret had advocated for, had fought insurance companies to approve, had volunteered to oversee personally. The paralyzed young ranger was learning to walk again in increments measured in millimeters of progress, and in his hand he still held the folded flag from his fallen team leader, the one memento he'd preserved through the darkest year of his life. His eyes met Margaret's across the ceremony, and for the first time since his injury, Corporal Reeves smiled. Not a grimace. Not a coping mechanism. A genuine smile. The kind that comes from knowing you're in the presence of someone who refused to let you disappear. Emma, Margaret's 8-year-old daughter, sat in the front row, finally understanding why Mom had been erased, finally proud instead of confused. She watched her mother receive the medals that had been sealed in Pentagon archives, Silver Star first, its 5-point silhouette catching the light. Bronze Star with V device next, the V denoting valor, the distinction that separates presence from action. Combat Medical Badge last, the symbol of someone who'd bled in service to others. The general who had saluted an empty chair said it simply, some warriors carry rifles. Some carry scalpels. All of them bleed the same when they stand between death and the people they've sworn to protect. Margaret's hands held the decorations lightly, the way she held everything, with the composure of someone who'd learned that control is the only thing that never leaves you. She stepped forward to the podium. The hospital staff who once had left when she sat down now competed to work her shifts. The nurses who'd been poisoned against her by Mercer's whispers now understood they'd been lied to by a man terrified of exposure. She spoke 5 sentences. Not one word more than necessary. I served this hospital by doing what I was trained to do. Sometimes that meant following protocol. Sometimes it meant breaking it to save a life. The difference between those two decisions isn't complicated, it's the difference between policy and conscience. I'm grateful to be allowed to serve without erasure. I'm grateful to the person who saw the truth and had the courage to expose it. And I'm grateful to Corporal Reeves for reminding me why I chose this path in the first place. She paused. The silence held. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Corporal Reeves raised his right hand. Arm crutch dangling from his wrist, folded flag still gripped in his other hand, he saluted Captain Margaret Walsh with the precision his injury had stolen but not completely destroyed. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the significance of the gesture, from the recognition of rank and service and sacrifice. Margaret saluted back, no longer hiding, no longer erased, finally allowed to exist as the full version of herself. The trembling in Reeves' hand steadied the moment he completed the gesture. When you've been given permission to stop disappearing, even a small movement feels like resurrection. The ceremony ended with applause that echoed off the trauma wing's new equipment. Margaret watched Corporal Reeves being wheeled back to his room, watched her daughter run toward her, watched the staff members who'd once abandoned her now wait patiently for a chance to work her next shift. In the parking lot, Dr. Mercer loaded the last of his medical supply boxes into the van, his shoulders curved inward like a man learning to fold himself into invisibility. She didn't need to watch him. She'd already moved past him. Captain Margaret Walsh walked out of St. Michael's that evening as herself, not the floor nurse nobody knew, not the erased soldier with classified history, but the full integration of every version she'd had to hide. Emma reached up and took her hand. Corporal Reeves had finally stopped waiting to understand why the woman who saved him had vanished. The hospital had a new trauma response team, and it was led by someone whose credentials had literally been sealed by the Pentagon. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it just needs to finally be allowed to exist. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones whose strength has been tested in ways most of us will never understand. Like this video, comment below with what you would have done if you'd been in Margaret's position, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the moment when a hidden hero finally gets to step into the light.